Hello, my name is Eric Morse Eskenazi. I'm the host of the Iraq Dispatches podcast. My guest on this latest episode is Chris Regan, who is an author, filmmaker, and screenwriter based in England. For any of you out there who love horror, the film Paintball Massacre, which Chris is a screenwriter for, is now available for streaming on the Tubi app. I hope all of you enjoyed listening to my interview with Chris. Hello, thanks for listening to the Erratic Dispatches podcast. We'll be back shortly after a brief break. Hello, I've been using Anchor.fm now for about almost a year for the podcast Erratic Dispatches, which is distributed through Anchor.fm. It's completely free to use, very easy, and any audio that you upload or record through the website, it will be you can use it to organize your audio files, and once your podcasts are ready to submit, it will be available to stream within at least 8 different streaming sites. Okay, Chris. So tell me, how did you start getting into screenwriting, and what were your main inspirations in film as a kid growing up?
All right. So let me think. So, well, screenwriting I'd done because I started writing when I was a teenager. I started writing novels. Not published novels, but I started writing some short stories and novels just for myself, really. And I sort of realized that the only reason I was writing novels was because I was sort of hoping that one day I would publish a book and someone would turn that into a film. And then I thought, well, maybe there's a way to skip that whole process and just write the film. So so I started. Kind of my late teens. I started screenwriting, and weirdly, it's a difficult question because it's in some ways in terms of the there's like two separate influences, because there's the films that influence me is one thing. In terms of actual screenwriting, like practically, I was very influenced by Tarantino, because I had this copy of the True Romance script that was my template, because they didn't have. I mean, those days they didn't have Final Draft. I don't think Final Draft was a thing then. I had a couple of screenwriting books that were kind of, I couldn't get my head around, but I had the True Romance script, and I could see the format. It was sort of, in a way, looking back, a terrible script to start with, because it's sort of so stylized and such in Tarantino's own voice, and in his scene descriptions are sort of epic and completely not the style that I write in now, but it was just useful to see that format laid out in a film that I liked. So that, and I guess Robert Rodriguez as well. Robert Rodriguez wrote Rebel Without a Crew, this film diary about mariachi, and I think a lot of people my age that who have sort of got into filmmaking and writing that influenced as well, because that was sort of around quite a lot then. But my cinema influences are kind of older, really. My favorite film is a film called Gun Crazy, Joseph H. Lewis film, 1949. That's like, I think there's something about that film. It's always stuck with me. I think because obviously it's got a famous heist scene that's all done in one take, but it's the kind of the central relationship in that film, which is essentially this was a Bonnie and Clyde type relationship between these two characters. You're never quite sure whether they're really in love or not, whether they're just being pushed along by the events, or and I think there's a sort of ambiguity to it that I really latched onto. And so the first script I wrote, which is very old now, and I never did anything weird, was a kind of Bonnie and Clyde type heist film. So so that was, I think that was one of my biggest sort of film influences.
And you're based in England?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
What part of England?
So I grew up in the Midlands, in Stoke-on-Trent, which is in the middle, and I kind of near, I guess, kind of Manchester, Liverpool that type of area. And now I live on the south coast, just near Brighton.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like I watched Paintball Massacre
Oh,
yesterday.
did you?
I was able to stream it on Tubi.
Oh,
I don't
okay.
know if we had that over there, Tubi, that they had it for streaming. So yeah, I really enjoyed it. Do you mind
Oh, cool.
talking about like developing the script and like and the film, and like were you actually on the set when they were during the production phase?
So I was towards the end. I went back for the yeah. I'll work backwards. But yeah, but the when they did reshoots, because I ended up being quite involved in the editing process, because there were like yeah. I'll come back to the beginning. So I got involved. I made a film called 10 Dead Men in 2006. I think that came out around then, which was a really kind of ultra low budget action film. It was kind of similar to the Lee Marvin film Point Blank. It
Mm-hmm.
was it was that kind of thing. The sort of, it's a gang and it's a revenge thing, and yeah, and that was a really kind of really micro budget. We sort of filmed it over weekends. Was that one I was kind of quite involved in the filmmaking, because the director Ross, he would sort of Ross Boyask, he's still making films now, but he would sort of, it would just be a case of like, oh, who's around this weekend, and we would get together, get whoever could come. He had a lot of friends who were stuntmen, and so there were loads of and women. There's loads of really quite excellent stunts in the film, even though we had no money, but
Mm-hmm.
because everyone wanted experience. Um, and so a couple of people who worked on that developed Paintball Massacre. So the lead actor in it, Brendan Carr, he ended up, it was his, Paintball Massacre was his idea. So some years later, he'd always said he had these other ideas for films, and then he kind of turned to producing, and so he contacted me about it. And then also the cinematographer on 10 Dead Men was Darren Berry, who directed Paintball Massacre. So yeah, it was kind of, well, quite a few years after. So over 10 years after we'd done 10 Dead Men, and we'd all done kind of our own different things in between. But we'd also always kind of, the three of us always kind of spoken about working on something together again. And so yeah, so one day they all kind of aligned, and I was working with something on Darren anyway, and on another idea, and then Brendan mentioned this paintball idea, and he'd got another producer involved, Joe Hallett, who had brought a lot of the investment for the film along as well. So and that was how it came about, and from there it happened quite quickly. They had the basic idea already of the sort of school reunion, and they're going to go and play paintball, and there will be a killer sort of picking them off one by one. That was already there, and a few of the deaths were already in there, and that was essentially what they came to me with. There was nothing, there were no real characters or anything else. It was just a few of the deaths and the basic premise. And so I think I wrote it quite quickly. I mean, it was over a few months. I did the first draft, and then it didn't kind of evolve. I mean, I think in the end there were about sort of 9 or 10 drafts, but they were quite, the bulk of the film was there in that first draft, really. And it was, yeah, and I think for me it was a lot about I came, because I'm a huge fan of horror films, but I sometimes, particularly with slasher films, I feel that the where they fall down is the character development, because I think there's an idea in slasher films that the pleasure of those films is in watching annoying people be killed horribly. But I've always found that if you don't care about the people in the film, then it's sort of boring. I mean, it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't matter how elaborately they're killed if you don't care about them. So that was really my kind of approach to the script was, how do we make these characters interesting, and they're not necessarily likable, but just interesting, so you care about what happens to them. So I spent a lot of time. I think the bit I spent the most time on was the there's the introduction scene when they're all in the pub, the reunion scene essentially at the beginning, and that went through the most rewrites, that one scene, because it was so hard to sort of introduce all those characters, and you can't spend that much time on it. But I wanted to give them each something to do and a little bit something to say, and get a sense of all of them, just enough that so you knew who these people were and cared about them, so that when people did start dying, that you were invested in it. Yeah, so that was but yeah, it all happened quite quickly after that. I mean, we did a couple of script read-throughs, and then they found, because they filmed it in a quarry that was actually used for paintball, and because it went through, there was a we tried to film it because myself and Darren and most of the actors were all based kind of near London, so there was a kind of an initial attempt to try and find somewhere around just outside London to film it, and that proved difficult. So when we ended up filming it in Somerset, which is where Joe, the producer, was from, and he got in touch with this paintball company who were using this quarry, and it was sort of brilliant. I mean, because you could make the whole film there, and it had everything. Like, it had different areas, so it had this big quarry area, but it also had this forest, and you could, it's when you go there, it's actually quite a small area, but it has enough kind of different views that you can kind of do all these different angles and make it feel bigger than it is. And so the whole thing was filmed over sort of 4 weeks, in October, I guess. It must have been 2018, I think. Yeah, and so 1 October, so over a month. I think I didn't go to the main shoot, because I think going into it, I was like, well, it's going to be difficult enough to get all this done, and I thought, well, you don't want me there, sort of like, I always think with films, like, once you get to the production stage, you sort of don't really. I feel like you don't really want the writer hanging around, because it's you want people. I always find that I want people to be able to do what they want with the dialogue, and change it and make it their own, and you don't want someone that. And it happened when I went to the reshoots, when the writer's there, and it's happened in other things I've done as well. People will defer to the writer to go, oh, can we just change that to this? Can we change that line or whatever? And I kind of think, well, yes, just sort of, it's yeah, best if you just do. So yeah, so I kind of stayed away from the main shoot, but I think it was quite a sort of, so it's someone else's story to tell me, but I think it was quite a difficult shoot. They had quite a lot of weather problems. I think the idea originally was to film it kind of in the order of the murders, so that ideally, you've got 10 actors, one by one they're getting killed off. So first person who dies, you do all their scenes first, and then they can go home when you've got one less person to pay for. That was the because again, there was a budget, but it was still very, very low budget. So and it didn't work out that way at all because of weather issues and things. Basically, the whole crew and all the actors were there for the whole 4 weeks, which I think ended up kind of doubling the budget, just in terms of paying for people to eat and somewhere to stay and things like that. And by the end of that, they'd only I think they'd got most of it, but I think it was about 70 to 80% finished. So there's still quite a lot to do. And then we were into winter, and we couldn't film anything over winter because of the weather. And yeah, so that was where I kind of got re-involved with it, really, because they wanted to. They couldn't really afford to get everyone back it was probably going to take realistically another couple of weeks to finish it as it was written. So instead, we kind of went back to the script and looked at what we could cut out, like what was the minimum amount we could film and in reshoots and still tell the story. And so we did. So I did a weekend. I went up for a weekend of reshoots, and we did that. Which was good because it was nice to actually sort of be there for that for a bit of it. And yeah, and then I was quite, again, so as I say, quite involved in the editing, just going through and making sure the story worked all the way through, and because it sort of turned into a bit of a sort of salvage project. It was a bit like, well, how can we like at one point it looked like it was never going to get finished at all, and then we kind of gradually kind of pulled it together and like, what can we do to make sure this still works? And got more people involved in it. Yeah, I'm really happy with how it turned out, because there was a point where it looked like it was never going to get there at all. So yeah.
And I noticed when I was reading like the IMDb like cast, like Nicholas Vince, the played Somerset the barman. I didn't realize that he had worked with Clive Barker in like the Hellraiser movies and in Ninth
Yeah.
Read. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah. He's so I'd got him involved because I'd so I've worked with two Cenobites because I worked on 10 Dead Men. We had Doug Bradley, who's Pinhead.
Oh yeah.
He did so it was this thing with that film, the because it's so low budget, we didn't one of the hardest things to do when you've got no money is filming, is recording dialogue, especially if you're outside. And a lot of the film was sort of shot outside, so we can't. I mean, it might even be a bit easier these days, but certainly in then back in sort of early 2000s, when we were doing it, it was the thing that separated the sort of, you could tell something was low budget if the dialogue recording was bad. So we deliberately wrote it with like minimal dialogue, almost like a silent film, with the idea that kind of like Point Blank and things like that, those kind of noir films, that there would be a narration over it. And then I can't remember how it came about, but the producer on that film, Phil Hobden, had this idea of getting Doug Bradley in to narrate it, and which completely changed the dynamic of it, because Brendan, who was the lead, there was no way him and his voice was Doug Bradley's voice, but we kind of rewrote it. I rewrote it as this kind of dark fairy tale thing. So and it ended up, again, it ended up working really well. So, but I did a day working with Doug in the sort of recording studio on that. That was really good. And then Nicholas Vince, I got to know through I did he does a podcast, and I was doing a horror web series a few years ago, and so he interviewed me for his podcast for this web series. We kind of kept in touch a bit and exchanged some feedback on various ideas and things, and then when this came up, we were looking for someone to play the bartender who because it was a bit of a weird role, because it was essentially the Crazy Ralph role, in Friday the 13th. Crazy Ralph turns up at the beginning, and it's that kind of, we needed that kind of role. We needed to, especially because the beginning is so kind of focused on the characters. There's not much horror in that first kind of 25 minutes, and so we needed something a bit creepy to go in there. And we had this role of the bartender who hadn't been cast yet, and this was getting quite close to production, and they were looking at various comedians to do it, just to get a kind of another name actor in. And I thought, well, and yeah, I suggested Nicholas do it, because I was like, well, it would be great to have a horror name do it, and I think that came off really well.
Yeah. And then Ian Virgo, who played the killer in the film, like, was anybody who specifically designed like the mask that he wore?
I think that was, I don't know. So that, because I know the mask had been around for a while, because I think Brendan was at some one point was going to use it on another project, but I can't remember whether it was Brendan or Joe who came up with the mask. I'd have to ask them. But that was but the Ian was, so that was he was originally signed on to play and I've forgotten, Matt, the guy who gets buried alive. I think it's Matt, but he was going to play him originally, and then there was some sort of scheduling conflict, because Ian as well has worked on some quite big films, so and he had some other projects he had to go and work on and couldn't do the shoot, but he said he could do a couple of days, so he agreed to swap and do the killer, and he brought Ryan in, who played Matt in the film. So that's how that came about, really.
And did like a Paintball Massacre, did it play like any festivals?
I did a few, yeah. It I can't remember. There there was one in the States it was in, but I've forgotten which one. It was all a bit weird because it came out in the middle of the sort of COVID times and lockdown and everything. So it's sort of it was a weird. Well, I think it was quite difficult to get it released anyway, because at the point we finished it and we were like, right, it's finished. The in terms of sales agents and distributors, no one really knew what they were doing, because like, the industry was sort of in a bit limbo in terms of things. But yeah, people weren't really looking to pick up new things necessarily at that point. So yeah, so and again, a lot of the festivals had been cancelled or were sort of being postponed. So yeah, it sort of that. I mean, it probably, I think it put off the release by about a year in the end, which happened to all kinds of things at that time. But it worked out quite well. I mean, it came out in the States first, and yeah, and had it sort of had a DVD release, and yeah, I guess so. What did you say you watched it on Tubi?
Yeah, Tubi.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Yeah. So I think it was on a few different places over there, and then about 6 months after that, it came out over here. We managed to have a sort of a screening of it because we never really got to do, normally especially when you work on a low budget film, you'll do a big screening where you get everyone back to watch the film, and we managed to just about do that. Kind of, it was in the middle of a lockdown, but we sort of did get a screening room in London and managed to get us all there. So we did all get to see it on the big screen at least.
Great.
And it's done pretty well. And I think it's done quite well in Germany. They released a Blu-ray of it, so it's obviously doing okay over there. So,
And I watched some of the episodes on YouTube of that web series Paz versus Stuff.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Do you mind talking a little bit about that series and how it came about?
Yeah, well, that was that was the series that Nicholas interviewed me about in his podcast. So it was it was a few years ago now, but it was not. I'd kind of got really fascinated by YouTube. I guess this was sort of around the time I started thinking about it. It was probably about sort of 2012, 2013, where YouTube was quite a big, well, YouTubers like and now obviously I think it's moved more into TikTok and Instagram and things, but there were sort of young people making, becoming really famous just off making videos in their bedrooms, and I sort of got fascinated by this idea, and more in the kind of I was really interested in the stuff that you didn't see. There was a YouTuber I was following, and I can't remember her name, but she was there were a couple of YouTubers, and they were both cosplayers, like video game cosplayers, and they both would do these videos about their sort of various conventions, but also what they're doing in their lives, and then I think they sort of had this horrible kind of really messy breakup, and you sort of found out about it after the fact, but it just kind of showed that this sort of the life that, I mean, it's obvious when you say it, but the life that was being presented was completely not what was going on behind the scenes. Like behind the scenes, I think it was quite messy and awful, but and I think it was things like that, and there were quite a few stories like that, and different things, and just the idea that the typical YouTuber would have a camera like this, and they would show their room, but you would never see kind of outside the frame that they'd set up that they completely controlled. And I wanted to kind of explore that and sort of mess with it a bit. So and I knew sort of a couple of projects had done similar things. There was Lonely Girl 15 was the famous one, which was a fake, in the early days of YouTube, was like a fake series. So I'd watched all of those, and Marble Hornets was one I was a huge fan of. The Slender Man, one of the first Slender Man projects, which I think still really holds up. So yeah, there were things like that, kind of found footage YouTube series that I wanted to do, and then it was also driven by kind of again, kind of economics, really. Like, how can I do this? How can I do a project? Because I'd made a few quite ambitious short films before then, which had just kind of taken over everything. Like it's there was so much work, and when you've got, again, when you don't have much money to sort of, to make a 20-minute short film will take me like a year and a half to sort of get it filmed and then edited and doing, when you just were working off favors and things. So I was like, well, okay, how can I do this cheaply? So I got I kind of drafted a kind of a script for about, I think it was about 60 episodes of this thing, and then, because they're all short, they're all sort of 2 or 3 minutes, and this basic story was, Paz is a YouTuber who she starts to get trolled. Essentially, someone starts to leave mean comments on her videos, and then that person starts to turn up in real life. But there was kind of much more going on than that. The thing about it was, I kind of got a bit it turned into a bit of an art experiment more than a series, because I kind of got so obsessed with the how much you could, I guess this was the presentation of it being real and how much you could get away with. So because that was the stuff that started to really interest me, was that, so Paz was also on Twitter, so I was running the Twitter account, and then there was an actor who played Paz and we filmed it in my shed. And but it were the moments where, like, when she got the actor got recognized in her job, in her sort of day job once, by someone who'd watched the videos, and so she sort of, she phoned me afterwards and she was like, oh, this just happened, and she just kind of dropped into character and pretended to be the character, and that was like, that's really interesting. I want to do more of that. And I think I probably did a bit too much of that, really, because that was we did start to do things in real life. We did a kind of YouTuber. We went to kind of a YouTuber meetup where a lot of, at the time, it was a big thing that a lot of YouTubers would get in a group and they would all meet up, and then they'd all post videos of that meetup, and it would sort of get to share the audience that way. So we went to one of those, and that's possibly in hindsight wasn't the best thing to do, because they were all very cross with me afterwards when they did find out that she was a fake person. But the thing that I ended up writing for there was a YouTube magazine that I think is gone now, so it's like okay to talk about, but it was quite a popular magazine in the UK, and they would kind of interview famous YouTubers and things, and I started writing for them as Paz, and then through that got Paz sent to like film premieres and things. So I'd send, the actor would go and kind of just be in character interviewing sort of actors and things, and stuff like that kind of that I thought that was amazing. But it was sort of impractical, because it's it sort of they wasn't, it kind of got to a point where I was like, well, we have to kind of wrap this up, because and partly because I did eventually get found out, and another YouTuber sort of did a big reveal video on the whole thing, but the story itself did wrap up in the I think you can still watch the videos all the way through, and it starts to make a sort of sense. The first ones are quite slow, because I was so interested in this idea of presenting it as real and doing little things, like she did early on, she does the most obscure horror films.
Yeah.
Right. So she does a film, she talks about a film, Tower of Fear, which doesn't exist. And just the fact that then people in the comments were like, oh, I've seen that one. And it's sort of, and this is what I became obsessed with, because I was like, well, how, if you've got someone talking about a film that doesn't exist and it's on YouTube, and then the people in the comments also say that they've seen that film that doesn't exist, like, who's to say it doesn't exist? I mean, like, it's sort of, I think there are some really interesting questions about what we do online, which I think have probably been sort of dealt with in other things since. But But yeah, but that story does follow the stalker does follow through, and I think there was some really good the best episodes that she had. Uh, she has a brother in it, sort of an older brother who, I mean, they don't really get on very well. But those episodes were the best because the two actors would just improvise. Basically, we would set a kind of loose. And this is kind of what I was saying earlier about not being bothered about the dialogue, but in those, like, because generally the episodes were sort of fairly tightly scripted, and I kind of encouraged Cheryl, the actor, to kind of make them her own, but she mostly kind of stuck to the dialogue and the scripts. But those episodes, whenever there was another person there, we kind of just opened it up, because it's really hard to, especially when you're just doing one take kind of naturalistic dialogue, it's hard to do that and for it to feel real. So they just kind of improvised, and there's a really good one later on where they're just kind of yelling at each other, and yeah, that's it was a weird experimental sort of web series that is still all on YouTube, and does definitely follow a story. So I still recommend checking it out. But yes, I don't know whether it was a success or not. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I plan to watch the other episodes. Definitely, I really enjoyed it. Yeah, the one where she talked about the different. So all the, like, those 4 films were all fake. The ones she brings out the
No,
DVDs.
only one of them. So only Tower of Fear was. I mean, they are quite obscure. Like Venus Drowning, I don't think I've ever met anyone who's ever seen that. But yeah, so they are quite obscure films, but they do all exist apart from Tower of Fear, which is, it's a book. I don't know if you know the author, Ramsey Campbell, who's a
Yes,
horror
yeah.
author. So he wrote a book called Ancient Images, which is it's one of my favorite books, and it's about this lost Bela Lugosi film called Tower of Fear. So I just nicked that and had that idea because I thought it was quite. And I messaged him afterwards, and I said, "Oh, I've stolen," and he thought it was great. But so I sort of had permission in a way. But yeah, so that's that. Yeah, that's where that came from. But yeah, we did, and I did. There was another one we did that was best, that her favorite albums, and she did a band that doesn't exist, and yeah, things like that. And but they're a little. I liked playing with the set as well and doing things, so there are little things going on in the background that you don't notice until you've watched. Well, there's towards the end, she shows you what's been going on, but yeah, just sort of playing with that format, really. Yeah.
With, like, when the episodes were appearing on YouTube, were they appearing like once a week, or like how regularly were they coming up?
They were roughly once a week. It was really hard to do because it was yeah, they were roughly once a week. They took, because I built up a bit of an audience through her blog, back when blogging was a thing. So she used to sort of review stuff on her blog, and again, I got people sort of sending, like, Arrow and things, sending me DVDs to review as this character. So we kind of that built up a bit of audience there and on Twitter, and then we started releasing them. It was weekly, but I think, like all these things, it was really hard to keep up the schedule. We used to film, we'd film about sort of 3 or 4 episodes over a weekend, and then I'd have like a month's worth to release. But towards the end, it got more and more kind of erratic, and also where we tried to do more ambitious things. Like I did one, which was all actors, but we went out into Brighton to a pub, and we filmed this kind of night out. And then when we released that video, one of the producers of, and I still don't know whether this was a genuine comment or whether it was just pointing out on how obviously fake it was, but one of the producers of Lone the Girl 15 commented on the video and said, "Oh, this is I really like the authenticity of this." I sort of thought, "Oh, I don't know if that's a real comment or not," but yeah, but as it kind of went on and became more ambitious, it was harder and harder to keep that schedule up. So and the last there's a sort of false end point, without giving too much away. There's a kind of false ending and towards that point, we were basically making a found footage film. We were going out in the woods and things and filming stuff, sort of Blair Witch style. And then it was also, after that, became a bit more complicated. The last few episodes were a bit weirder and a bit more complicated. So Yeah, that's a long answer to say. I mean, basically, to say by the end it was all over the place. Where the release schedule it was sort of every few weeks, but yeah, I mean, it got to a. Though I remember there was a key point where Cheryl, the actor, and it was all dependent on her. Like if she wasn't, if she gave up on it, then I was going to finish. And so, and she came to me once and said, "I don't know." Don't really understand where this is going, and up until that point, I'd kind of just been enjoying the ride of it and kind of going, oh, we can, this is really exciting, we can do all this stuff. And then I thought, no, okay, we do have to wrap this up. And that was when I started kind of winding it down. So I guess, I mean, the filming was probably about 2 years overall with sort of different, release schedules. But yeah.
Wow, that's great. Hello, thanks for listening to the Erratic Dispatches podcast. We'll be back shortly after a brief break. So yeah, mention if you don't mind talking a little about I saw like the trailer for Hit the Big Time. It was a short.
Oh yeah, that was so that one was when I did 10 Dead Men, the action film, there were two hitmen characters in it. It was sort of because of the way that film was made, and it was kind of all over the place, and it wasn't really scripted that they were kind of comedy hitmen characters, but the two actors who did it were friends, and they kind of they brought this sort of comic relief to those scenes. And after that film came out, they came to me and said, we'd got an idea, we'd like to do something else with these characters. I mean, spoiler, they die in 10 Dead Men, but they thought, oh, we could do something else with these characters. So we wrote this short film, and that was quite it's a while ago. It was quite a difficult process. I remember it went through a lot of different versions. I had this idea about sort of old it's this two British hitmen, and the story of the film is that it's these two kind of old movie stars. So they're now kind of I guess in the 70s, kind of not really working anymore, movie stars, and they've got this rivalry going back years. And so one of them hires a hitman to kill these two hitmen to kill the other, and which gave this kind of opportunity. So we had like scenes in this kind of starts in London, and then they go to America, and I think it's in LA, and I think it ends up in, I can't forget where it ends up, wherever Sundance is filmed. It's sort of somewhere around there, I think. And I think again it was one of these things where there wasn't much money, but it tied in with the director, and a few other people were going over there anyway, so it all kind of worked out. But it was one of those things. It was supposed to be it was kind of a prototype for a feature that we never really got to do, and it was a shame really, because the feature I thought was really funny. Like there are bits in the short. They ended up releasing it as a web series, and I think it's still online somewhere. It might be on Vimeo. There are moments that are really good that work, but then overall, I don't think it was it wasn't great. And it was one of those things as well that, as like I was saying about the short films that I did, because you can, I find when there's not much money and you're kind of on a micro budget, it's easy enough to get people together to do the filming, because you can people are enthusiastic about that, and it's fun, and actors want the sort of, especially if they're just starting out, or that they want the showreel experience, so you can get people together and sort of do that fairly minimally, but post-production is when things really slow down, because it's hard work and sort of, and people are less willing to do that for a favor. And so, but if you're not paying them, then it's kind of because I remember that I remember the footage for Hit the Big Time just went round like a circle friends, sort of different people saying, "Oh yeah, I'll do it," and then they got busy with something else and couldn't do it and moved on to someone else. But yeah, but it's a bit of a it's a bit of a shame because it didn't the feature script I wrote, and it was written with no kind of constraint in mind. It was as if we had we could do like a huge budget kind of, it was like a sort of road movie across the states with these two British hitmen, and yeah, I'm still really pleased with it. They did kind of they talked about the two actors kind of brought it up again a few years later, no, a few years ago even, but they wanted to do, and I don't know if they've pursued this since, they wanted to do something, a different idea again, and I just thought that original script was so, I was so happy with it. Not saying it was perfect, but I was so happy with it. I was like, well, I don't really want to write another script when we did so much work on that one, and so yeah, so I kind of left it there. But yeah, I think I don't know if that's worth checking out. It's online, but there was something, I don't know, there were some interesting moments in it, I think. Yeah.
Do you mind talking about, like, is there any upcoming projects you're working on?
Yeah, well, I sort of gone back to I mean, I've got a couple of screenwriting things that I'm kind of I probably can't really talk about yet, but I've in lockdown I kind of went back to novel writing, and I wrote a horror novel last year called Astaroth, which is I'd written it as a play. I sort of had this idea I was going to start writing plays, and I wrote this play about kind of inspired by the Devil Rides Out, the Hammer film. So Christopher Lee and is like a paranormal investigative person, and most of the Devil Rides Out is set in that one room where he draws the circle on the floor, and it's such a great idea, and it's really badly dated because the effects are so bad, but it's still like a really solid idea, and then the book's great as well, the Dennis Wheatley book. So I wanted to do something like that. I was like, we could do that as a play, and then I didn't do anything with the play. But when I started, I kind of was messing around with writing novels and with self-publishing and things, and I thought, oh, that might work as a book. So yeah, so it's the basic idea is it's these two rival ghost hunters, because I was briefly obsessed with ghost hunting as well, because I used to watch, me and my wife used to watch Ghost Adventures quite a lot, and there's a British show as well, Most Haunted, that we used to watch. The the ghost hunting shows where they go and sort of, and I was sort of fascinated by the kind of the egos involved, mostly like the sort of. So I've always been really interested in ghosts and paranormal things. I don't really believe in ghosts, but I think that's what makes it interesting is the sort of that idea of belief and how much people are willing to invest in that. And we did me and my wife did a couple of ghost hunts here, and there's a group that does it near us, and I was sort of struck by how just not scary it was. Like how the sort of, even being, I'm quite an easily scared person, but even, we're in these old buildings in pitch black darkness, kind of calling on spirits, and it's just sort of boring, really. But which made me realize how much they put on in those shows, how much it is for the camera, and how much they sort of so one of these ghost hunters who goes to this house is that kind of character. He's a sort of TV ghost hunter who has probably faked most of the stuff that he's ever experienced. And then the other character is the complete opposite. He's a complete skeptic, and but he had this one unexplainable thing happen to him when he was a kid that he's never been able to get his head around. So he's kind of pursuing ghost hunting in that he believes that something happened to him as a kid with a ghost, and so he becomes a ghost hunter, but all he really does is debunk hauntings, and no one is really interested in that. So he's been a complete sort of like financially, as a career, he sort of failed. So they both go to the same haunted house with the on the same day and try and fix this haunting, and it sort of escalates from there. But it ends up very much in that Devil Rides Out. They're in a room and they have to sort of figure out how to get out. But yeah, so that's sort of that's Astaroth. But yeah, I'm really happy with that. It's sort of and it's got some quite good reviews so far. So I think it's working, and it's intended to be part of a series. Not it's like a standalone book, and all the book there's a framing story about a mortician who kind of discovers these stories, and so I'm working on the next book in that series, but again, it will be a standalone sort of ghost story. Yeah.
Great. How many books have you published so far?
Well, I've published 4, but they're really, I mean, Astaroth is the sort of most that's the closest to an actual novel. The others were sort of novellas, really, based on, because I did these 3 short films actually about a witch called Jenny Ringo. They were sort of comedy horror films, and so originally I started adapting those into books. So I released 3 of those, and again, not really anywhere near finishing that series, but I've sort of put that on hold for a bit to explore this other thing. And I'll probably will go back to it at some point. But yeah, so they're more kind of horror comedy. But I think what's nice about there's the sort of self-publishing thing is being able to experiment a bit and get things out, because I find the process of screenwriting, like professionally, just is quite sort of can be quite torturous. Like the sort of Paintball Massacre experience was a one-off, really. Like I've never, that was the only one, and it wasn't easy. By the end, it wasn't easy. Almost all fell apart. But in terms of, I wrote it, and then that same year they were filming. Never really, like, I think like most screenwriters, I mean, because the biggest film I worked on was a film called London Heist. Like that was the film that was the biggest budget. But my involvement with that was fairly minimal. Like I came on at the end as really more of a script editor, and but I ended up working quite closely with Craig Fairbrass, who wrote the original script and is the actor in it. And so yeah, he gave me a credit on that. But yeah, that's kind of the biggest thing. And that again was one where, I did my work on it, and then sort of that took years. It took another couple of years for him to film it, and then another 3 years, I think, before it actually was released. And that even seems, and again, I think most screenwriters will say this as well. On top of that, there are all the projects I've worked on that just never went anywhere. The projects that have been at the sort of highest level, that have sort of been paid the most for, I suppose, are mostly things that never came out, or like, and and sometimes that process, there's a sort of TV thing I'm working on at the moment, and it's just kind of especially when you're kind of in the kind of early like pilot stage, and you're just trying to there's no money in it yet, you're just trying to get it to a point where you can show it to people and hopefully kind of get investment. And it's you're just sort of facing an endless notes, really. Like and then the further things go on, and I've had this with film projects as well, the further things go on, the more and more people get involved and attached to it, and then they all have their own ideas and their own notes, and you end up kind of so. And that, I think that was really why I was like, I can't do, when I started writing novels, I was like, I can't go down the traditional publishing route. And I just couldn't face the endless rewrites that I've got that going on with screenwriting. I just want to finish something. And because I think that's the nice thing about it, is you get to finish something and you put it out there. better or worse, but it's there.
Hmm.
Whereas with screenwriting, you often will spend months working on things that never go any further than a file on your computer. It's just sort of that two or three other people read, and then that's it. But yeah.
Do you like in like other? Do you work in other capacities as well, like in film? Like, do you act ever, or produce, or direct?
No, not really. I mean, they did the short films I directed, and which I quite liked, but it's I think again, I don't know if I could I think when you're working with no money, you end up sort of doing so many different jobs at the sort of low budget level, because you kind of you're sort of also producing and doing all these different bits. And well, I mean, everyone is. You normally get a crew of like 5 or 6 reliable people, and everyone kind of does a bit of everything. And so yeah, so I don't know, but those films were kind of a means to get the writing onto film. So I was never that interested in actual, like, I don't think I'm a visual person in terms of filmmaking. It was just about how do I get these cool scenes that I've written and filmed. So yeah, so I've done some, and I've done some. I assistant directed a play a couple of years ago, but yeah, and I've done odd bits of. Paz versus stuff. I did all the that was all me, was all the directing and the editing, but certainly not professionally. So I think it's useful to know how to do all these different bits and to understand what goes on. But yeah, it's also, I mean, I think the great thing about film is it's having kind of people specializing in different areas. I remember the first time I was at because I went to film school in Brighton, and I remember the first time I worked with a cinematographer who was, because before then everything I'd made I'd just sort of held the camera myself and done all that, and the first time you do that, and that person's going, oh yeah, well I'll do this and I'll go here, and you talk about it, and they figure out the lighting and everything, and it was sort of amazing, really. I think that's the sort of and yeah, and the bigger things that you work on, like with Paintball Massacre, there was there was a whole sort of crew of all different kind of specialisms working on that. So I think that's the great thing about film, is that you get these people and I think when people just, it's also good when people stick to their jobs and go, right, this is what I'm really good at, and then you put those people together, it works out really well. But yeah, I can't remember why I started talking about that, but yes, it's
What do you find the biggest joys and challenges of being a screenwriter?
I think like the best thing is when you see something finished. I mean, like, I think that's one of the most exciting things is something you've written. Like when we had that screening of Paintball Massacre in lockdown, but we managed to see it all, and all the sound had been mixed and everything, and it was the the best possible way of seeing that film with all the people who made it. That was kind of amazing. I do like the collaborative aspect of screenwriting as well, and I think this is also the biggest challenge, and it depends on who you're working with as to whether it can be the best thing or the worst thing. But if you're working with people who are kind of and you're all on the same page, I think there is it can be really exciting. Like, there've been moments on this project I've been working on recently where we've had really kind of quite intense sort of script meetings that have gone into the early hours of the morning, where there'll be 2 or 3 of us working on this project on a call, going through the script kind of line by line, sort of running through scenes, and you do build up this momentum, and it's really, really exciting. But I think that can also be depending on, it can also be quite soul destroying when you get I've had times when a new sort of producer comes onto a project and they want to take it in a completely different direction, and you're just not that into it. And it's sort of like, oh, okay. I often think of there's a there's and it's more to do with acting, but I think it actually applies a lot to screenwriting as well. There's I think it's Yates, but there's and I've nicked this from, I think I heard it from a Val Kilmer interview talking about Yates. But this idea of, if you are writing a poem about something, I think he talks about writing a poem about a tree, and you have to just keep rewriting it and rewriting it and rewriting until there's nothing of you in the poem anymore, and it's just about the tree. And I think screenwriting, I've come to realize, is quite similar, because you think, and this is sort of going back to where I started, like with Tarantino, you think you're going to be like, because the people, the auteur people, and the people who we sort of, a lot of people who that, I think the people like that are in a sort of minority, really. The people who do this sort of stylized sort of, this is definitely their own voice type film. I think for most screenwriters, it is a case that you kind of end up going through the process again and again until there's nothing. And I don't mean this in a bad way necessarily as a negative, but you sort of have to get yourself out of it, and so it's just until it's just the characters, really. And I think it's one of the things, particularly with the later Tarantino films, I have a problem with, is that, you know, so many of the characters in the Tarantino film speak with his voice, like, and I think at the bottom end of that, something like when in Death Proof, where it just didn't feel, it was quite jarring that all these characters were speaking with his voice, and it sort of it doesn't quite work quite as well. Whereas think of Reservoir Dogs, you sort of get away with it. But I do think that there's to get to kind of a level of authenticity, you have to go through this process of rewriting until those little the little quirks of stuff kind of come out of it completely. Like Paintball Massacre, in a way, suffers from this. Like, I'll admit, there's a lot of it that is just me. Like, all the Fast and Furious stuff is just me. Sort of, that's how I feel about Fast and Furious, and which is fun and it's cool to do that. But I think the truly great stuff is you do get to a point where it's just the characters speaking as the characters, and to get to that point is a lot of work. So I think that's probably the biggest challenge of the whole thing, is just getting to this authenticity in a format that is it doesn't fit with authenticity in a way, because the scenes are so short and everything. It doesn't quite, you have to kind of, you're sort of faking authenticity. But that makes sense.
What would you say, Chris, if like a young, I don't know, like a teenager approached you and they said they're interested in becoming a screenwriter? What kind of advice would you give to them?
I think you just have to do stuff, like make films. Like, I think, because, and I know people will say, well, I don't want to make films, I want to write things, but even just getting together with, finding someone to direct and doing a short film, because I think because the way the things that the films that I've had made all came through, like I was saying at the beginning, about the people who worked on 10 Dead Men ended up, 10 years later we do Paintball Massacre, all came through those sort of connections. Doing 10 Dead Men, which was very much a film that a few friends made on weekends, and through that process I made the connections that then I can trace everything I've worked on back to that in some way through different routes. But I think definitely that you have to sort of bear in mind that it's collaborative, and finding other people to work with is the way to do it. And finding people, even if it's just, and I do this with everything now that I write, any script that I write, just get some friends together to do a reading. Like, if you've written something, and if you record it as well, you notice immediately what works and what doesn't work. And again, it's going back to that thing of going through, trying to get your voice out of it in a way, to make the dialogue authentic. Once you get a group of people in a room and you hear the scenes, it changes it drastically, because you go, yeah, of course that doesn't make any sense, and you can't. It's hard to hear that when you're just reading it in your own head and you've got all these different characters speaking. So yeah, I would say get other people involved and start producing stuff, even if it's just a recorded reading. That's better than it just being a thing on a page. That I think there's this real kind of, and I'm not the first person to say this, but I think there's a real, in the screenwriting world, there's a real kind of lottery winners sort of approach to it, where there's this idea, and I think from the stories that came out really in the 90s when I started, of there were odd stories about writers who would write this one script and they would send it to the right person and get a sort of $10 million the next day. And obviously it never really worked. Like when you look into those stories, that's never how it worked, but those are the stories that kind of tracked. And so there's this sort of idea that you're almost, it's a really long-winded way of writing a lottery ticket, because choosing lottery numbers, because you sort of spend 6 months to a year writing a script and then send it off and hope that someone sees it at the right moment. There's so much chance involved in the bigger films to sort of get something finished and picked up. And so, and I think that's the wrong approach, really, because I think you just end up, it's just so sort of crushing to go through years of that. Whereas if you kind of make something, even if no one ever sees it, like the process of doing it is exciting and interesting. And I always find that if you're making stuff, and this is why I went to the books in lockdown, just to do something, but if you're doing stuff and creating things, other opportunities come about. I find there's almost a natural kind of thing, especially with filmmaking, where there are other people involved, because then someone will say, oh, I'm doing this one, do you want to help me with this? Like, I've had so many opportunities like that have just come about through working on something, and someone else's had their own thing that they want to work on. So yeah, I think just going and actually making things is the main piece of advice I'd give.
Hello, thanks for listening to the Erratic Dispatches podcast. We'll be back shortly after a brief break. Thanks again for tuning in to this latest episode of the Erratic Dispatches podcast, featuring an interview with my guest, Chris Regan, author, filmmaker, screenwriter, based in England, lover of the horror genre. For any of you who have the Tubi app, please stream the film Paintball Massacre, which Chris is the screenwriter for now. It's very entertaining, very funny. And also make sure to go on the link I posted on my Anchor FM profile page for this podcast, in which you could purchase Chris's novels through his Amazon author page. And also I do have links on both my Anchor FM profile and also through the website of Erratic Dispatches through BrooklynDigitalMediaInc.com, in which there are contribution buttons, donation buttons. I appreciate any kind of contribution, donation to my podcast. And I'll be back soon with a new episode. Take care. Bye-bye.